Hey all, here OS Reviews. In our other recent video, we checked out the Tanchjim Origins, which are a pair of flagship-grade IEMs using a single dynamic driver setup. Pretty unique, but sounded excellent. And today we're taking a look at two more products from this brand, but they represent more of the budget side of their catalog. More specifically, the Zero Ultima and the Stargate 2. The Zero Ultima is a wired headphone that comes in two configurations, one which has a traditional 3.5mm analog headphone jack, and the other which has a built-in DAC using USB Type-C for more modern smartphones, for instance. And they sell at only around $16 to $17 a pop, so under 20 bucks, compared to the, again, flagship Origins, which were over $250. We're catering towards audiophiles with a deeper pocket, compared to these being just a lot more accessible. But what about the sound quality? Is it also 10 times inferior to that flagship model? That's one question that we'll discuss later in this video. The other one, the Stargate 2, is a DAC. It's a digital to analog converter, so it plugs into USB Type-C of modern smartphones, tablets, and computers that may no longer have a standard headphone jack, but it then converts into a 3.5mm connector that you can use to plug in analog-style headphones with modern devices while incorporating a higher-end DSP chipset inside that should provide you with a slightly more hi-fi experience as it's converting digital to analog signal. Recapping a couple of housekeeping points we mentioned in our Ultima review, Tanchjim is a brand that non-audiophiles may not be quite as familiar with, but they're actually an older sibling to Moondrop. But because of their insistence on using single driver setups on the majority of all of their headphones, they have been often overshadowed by brands like Moondrop or KZ that are trying to push for more and more drivers packed into a pair of headphones, in some crazy instances having even 10 drivers, aka speakers, inside of a pair of IEMs, which definitely catches your attention from a marketing perspective, versus Tanchjim kind of reminds me of the old Google Pixel smartphones, where they always used hardware, including that 12-megapixel Sony camera, which was seemingly behind the times on a hardware level, was optimized to perform really well thanks to computational photography and processing work. And a similar analogy can be made here because, again, Tanchjim are using a single dynamic driver, but trying to crank as much detail and performance out of it through really calculated tuning of that driver. Like the Origin, however, it does not come with any detachable cables, so the wire here is soldered in, meaning that it's not going to be quite as modular or replaceable as on their higher end models, so just keep that in mind. And there is, again, a $1 price difference between the 3.5mm analog jack version compared to the USB Type-C version that has a built-in DAC of its own. And the Zero Ultima does come with an inline microphone as well as remote control for playing and pausing audio, which is actually a neat extra that we didn't find on the Origin. They're still using the Harman curve for tuning, which is a target frequency response for headphones that aims to produce the best sound quality for most listeners, collecting data from around the world over the past decade or so. One other difference here is if we look at the bottom corner of the packaging, you can see that it's touting their, again, dynamic driver technology 4. So it's based on their 4th gen architecture or hardware of their drivers compared to the Origin that was technically using the Gen 5 design instead. So one way to look at it is on the budget pair, they're using a setup here for the drivers which might be one generation behind for their own catalog, compared to on their flagship pair getting the cutting edge components and tuning. But anyways, inside of here we have just the headphones themselves, as well as you will find a quick user guide. We also have a small carrying pouch on the inside of this one, in addition to some silicone tips to get a more snug fit, small, medium, and large. As for the headphones, it continues with a pretty clean design, so they are visually cohesive compared to the aforementioned more expensive Origins as well. Once again, there is some asymmetry with one side having the Zero or the name of the headphones and the other one having the logo of the brand, just like on the Origins. And then we have that aforementioned inline remote control, which is nice, plus a play pause key. So we have a metal shell and then a plastic button here which is see-through, which is echoed on the Buds as well, where we can see inside some of the components. The ends though aren't magnetic, so they don't really stick together, but considering the extremely low price point, I would say it's forgivable. And if we remove the silicone tip here, you can see the mesh is still crafted out of metal, although this time around, unlike the more expensive flagship pair, there won't be quite as many modular components. On that one, there were even meshes that you could screw on to change the density that could influence the sound ever so slightly to become more bass forward versus treble forward. On here, it is more of a one-size-fit-all approach, a bit more conventional. Also, one surprising benefit of the design on these Zero Ultimas is they are quite lightweight, more so than the Origins, because they were crafted entirely out of a unibody chunk of metal. So they actually feel a little bit less weighty as you're wearing them, although the IEM design did have a cable that wrapped around the back of the ears when you were wearing them that made them a little bit more resistant if you are slightly moving, kind of like sports headphones. And we have the USB Type-C version with a built-in DAC of its own that has just a plastic tip over here. I felt that the silicone tips also provided some nice natural noise isolation on its own, so sound leakage wasn't too problematic, but obviously you won't find any active noise cancellation on a pair like these, so if you're trying to block out even louder engine sounds, fan noises, things like that won't really be repressed. That is a feature missing on the majority of these wired headphones at this point in time compared to wireless TWS pairs. Benefits of a wired headphone include lower latency as well as not really needing to have a battery of its own. So you never need to worry about charging it up, unlike wireless buds, plus batteries inside of electronics can degrade over time and often becomes a point of failure, which is why with AirPods, for example, maybe the battery stops holding its charge after a couple of years of use and you have to eventually replace it. It becomes a disposable compared to a kind of analog solution like this. As long as the cable doesn't break, you can continue to use it for years down the line. And also ensuring as little detail gets lost as possible when being connected to the headphones, versus Bluetooth is inevitably a lossy signal. As it's being sent wirelessly, even the best codecs, including LDAC as well as aptX, will still be compressing and losing a little bit more compared to a wired connection like this, which is why, again, audiophiles are still using wired headphones to this day. So all of those benefits ring true here even on a less expensive pair like the Zero Ultimas. Moving to sound quality and performance, I'm glad to report that for their price point, they definitely punch above its weight class, consistently providing more clear as well as detailed audio reproduction than the majority of other budget $20 wireless buds. And the sound profile here is U-shaped, sounding energetic with ample warmth. The bass here is also relatively rumbly and impactful. Now, it's not going to be earth-shattering. That never seems to be the forte of Tanchjim headphones necessarily if you are a true bass head, because of the limitations of a single driver at the end of the day. However, they're still satisfying enough that you can feel the slam of a drum beat, for example, and also the bass on a guitar groove will be well-defined and weighty, offering a pleasant enough experience. For the mid-range, it is recessed but warm sounding. This is where vocals and many instruments reside, slightly pushed back in the mix, but it's not completely absent either. The warmth in the mid-range adds sufficient body and weight to the vocals, particularly deeper voices like baritones and tenors, also benefiting instruments like brass and percussion, giving them a natural full sound. Subsequently, female vocals and strings still retain a sense of clarity and crispness, preventing the mid-range from sounding overly muddy. The treble here was also smooth and well extended, can be thought of as sounding glossy and airy. That adds a sense of spaciousness, so it extends well into those higher frequencies without being too harsh or sibilant, aka offering good vocal detail without any piercing or fatiguing qualities. Furthermore, they offered above average performance when it came to the soundstage still being quite spacious, and so you're able to really delineate between instrumentals as well as if you're watching a movie, clearly hear as elements are kind of moving around in the space around you. Again, definitely above average performance for their price point. Granted, returning to our original point and comparing them to the Ultimas, I would say there is still a noticeable difference if you are wearing them side by side. Whereas these might be a 7.5, close to an 8 out of 10, those are closer to a 9, if not 9.5, depending on the genre that you're listening to. In other words, the 5th generation drivers can provide for truly nuanced listening that audiophiles will definitely appreciate. It's not a night and day difference, however, and again, it's kind of the difference between good and excellent, which I would argue, since there is a 10 times difference in price, this is arguably a better value, because it gives you a taste of what the tuning experience is like on Tanchjim's products without spending an arm arm or leg, and if you do like the experience here, it might convince you to upgrade to one of the more premium pairs, having even better build quality, as well as squeezing out even more impressive sound. So as a truly budget, no-frills pair, I would say the Zero Ultimas actually do a very fine job. The built-in microphone was also functional enough, but again, don't expect any ambient noise cancellation or reduction capabilities. So as long as you're in a relatively quiet space, like indoors or maybe at home, you can definitely use these to answer a call without too many issues, although there is no volume up or down key built into the remote. It's also worth mentioning that if you pick up the USB Type-C version of the Zero Ultimas, you can leverage an optional companion app for mobile, including iOS, Android, and even available for Windows computers as well. Honestly, this is an extra that I really wasn't expecting, and since it's a wired USB DAC or headphone, you simply need to plug it in, and then it should be recognized after a split second. Some additional EQ profiles, even though by default the natural tuning I think already sounds excellent, but if you're not satisfied with that, you can instead opt for other presets including instrumental enhancement, more for pop music, a more balanced profile, and also a neutral sound. Now the labels are sometimes a little bit funny in terms of their translation, but at least I appreciate the fact that you have some of those controls on a pair that only sells for $15. Now you can also go into a custom game EQ mode, where very interestingly they have created some custom profiles for specific games and titles like Genshin Impact, League of Legends, Call of Duty, so on and so forth. So it's incredibly granular, and you can even find some PC titles as well as even some Nintendo Switch games as well. Depending on the soundtrack, for instance with Mario and Pokemon, perhaps it's more upbeat and cheerful, so it applies kind of a pop sound filter to the EQ, versus Call of Duty and PUBG, which maybe enhances the bass a little bit more, and it does make a subtle difference. And back onto this main home screen, we can see that the current EQ has been applied. You can also check out a EQ forum, so this is where other community members have created their custom sounds that you can take advantage of as well, just by reading the description and then download or apply their tuning. Now it does seem like many of these are still in Chinese, however, because this brand is more popular in Asia, and that seems to be where the majority of their community members and users of their app might be located. So if they can perhaps translate this to English just for easier legibility for international users, that would be great. You can always use Google Translate though to understand what these users are trying to do, maybe one here for rock music. And if you wanted to, you can even share your own creations or profiles with other community members by publishing it into the My tab. There's also a final tab here, which is going to give you the frequency sliders if you want to get into that level of granularity, tweaking the different spectrums yourself. And you can again save it onto your local memory or contribute and push it over to your profile for others to see. So that is one advantage compared to the 3.5mm analog headphone jack version of the Zero Ultimas will not be compatible with this companion app because it doesn't have that built-in DSP chip, which is recognized by the software app. So if you want to leverage this functionality, I would say it is worth spending the extra dollar to get the, again, Type-C version thanks to that built-in chipset. Next up, a closer look at the Stargate 2 DAC, which I have to say is one of the most compact hi-fi DACs that I've come across. It's literally just a small dongle, super tiny, but claims to improve on the audio experience. It can drive larger studio-style headphones as well, plus again, give you back the analog headphone jack for those looking for it, instead of buying necessarily a brand new DAC or player just to get that headphone plug. So you can pair this with a newer smartphone, computer, laptop that might be missing this port nowadays. There's going to be a quick user guide here, and then down below we have just the actual DAC, which again, super small, and I like the fact that there is a window on the design, providing just a slightly more interesting design touch. And it is fairly well constructed, built out of aluminum alloy on the Type-C head here with a braided nylon finish there in the middle, Stargate 2 branding here on the other side. The silver colorway otherwise blends right on in with all of their product catalog offerings at this point in time. So visually, it's quite cohesive, although this brand, it seems like, isn't really experimenting with more flashy colors. It's all quite classic in this one colorway. As for some hardware specs, they're claiming to use the CS43131 DAC, which should tout low distortion levels as well as a wide frequency range. Again, the footprint weighing only 4.3 grams might be one of the most impressive aspects of this particular DAC, practically taking up no space or weight at all, while still being a higher quality chip than what is likely built into the majority of smartphones and mobile devices by default. So again, low distortion as well as high signal-to-noise ratio just means when you're plugging in headphones, listening to audio, you shouldn't really hear too much hissing or any background noise aside from just the audio itself. Hopefully will be very clean and crisp. As for compatibility, it will work with any Type-C device, including Android, iOS, as well as Linux, Chrome OS, Mac OS, Windows computers, so on and so forth. And you can just plug in any 3.5mm headphone onto the other end. So for example, this can be a pair of IEMs, including the Tanchjim Origins that we reviewed, larger studio-style headphones as well. So although this looks a little bit ridiculous, we now have it connected to a extra large pair of biodynamic custom pro headphones, and this tiny little DAC is powerful enough to still drive these larger headphones, providing sufficient volume output for them to function, which is good to see, and in my testing indeed worked just fine. Now specifically when it comes to the audio performance of this DAC, I found it to be neutral sounding, which is exactly what you want from a DAC. It doesn't by default change the audio experience too much, providing a clear audio output onto your headphones that you're connected to. Now, maybe the only asterisk is there is a added hint of warmth with the sub-bass response perhaps being a little bit more aggressive compared to if I were plugging these headphones directly into a 3.5mm jack and listening to the same track. So the sub-bass, I would say, is maybe cranked up by one level compared to a completely flat, perfectly neutral audio reproduction. But all in all, it still is providing a very clean sonic listening experience that can bring out plenty of the details and nuances to the track that you're listening to. Especially with the mids and trebles, they're going to sound very faithful to the original recording. So I would say this is a pretty neat accessory, allowing you to reuse your existing smartphone, equipment that you already have, versus getting a completely new player that has a built-in DAC of its own. That can be something to consider. Although technically, if we're being very nitpicky, yes, there are even higher-end DACs out there that can have even more sophisticated audio chips with even more nuanced processing, but this one is already rated to support 32-bit DSD, 64, 128, or 256, which I would argue is already sufficiently detailed and nuanced enough, so it really is not a bad performing DAC for something that is so small in this dongle form. And just like the Zero Ultima Type-C edition, the Stargate 2 DAC, because of the built-in DSP chip, is also recognized by their official companion app, again available for iOS, Android, as well as Windows computers. We have access to pretty much the same controls that we saw on the Zero Ultimas, by default already sounding quite good, but you can instead emphasize vocals as well as instrumentals versus more of a pop sound, and there's also a neutral sound profile at the very bottom as a couple of presets. What's different on the Stargate 2 DAC though is you also have a couple of options that are specifically designed if you are pairing this DAC with some of their other headphones, including the Tanchjim Origins, the Ones, Kara, Hana, as well as Prism, Oxygen, even the Zero Ultima if you have the 3.5mm headphone version. And so if you pair the DAC with some of their official headphones, it also claims to just curate the sound even more based on some of the properties of those drivers, tightly integrated and comprehensive. So if you're listening to audio while gaming, you can find specific titles made for mobile, PC, as well as Nintendo Switch. Again, I wasn't expecting to see this, but it applies kind of a surround sound effect and also plays around with the tuning a little bit more depending on the genre of game. Plus the final tabs here are going to be the forum section, leveraging even more profiles created by community members. For instance, I've selected the Origin IEMs, and now it's popped up some more default tuning profile, natural, balanced, popular, musical, again, all based on the Harman curve. And speaking of, the final area here is where you're able to adjust things in a more granular way. Specifically for the DAC, you're able to increase the decibel amount or the loudness of the sound up to 4 dBs boosted, or make it a little bit more quiet, specifically for different frequencies, playing around with more granular controls. So there we have it. That's been just a closer look at the Zero Ultima as well as the Stargate 2 from Tanchjim. And as we alluded to earlier in this video, even though this represents their budget side, in the case of the Zero Ultima, even though they're 10 times less, they're definitely not 10 times inferior in terms of sound. But it just goes to show when you're getting to the extreme end, maximizing gains between 99% and 100%, that last touch point nearing levels of obsession is often when you have to give up the most as well. So in this case, a huge delta in price, which is why I think for an entry-level pair, these are actually going to be perhaps more suitable for the average consumer that are just trying to get their toes dipped into the audiophile space. So you can check out more details if you are interested in any one of these two pairs in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a double feature of the Stargate 2 mini DAC as well as their Zero Ultima wired headphone.